Welcome to the May 2016 update for the Microsoft Australia OEM Server team. In this update, we'll be focusing heavily on Windows Server 2016 because we've just had Technical Preview 5 released. So this is something where we actually went through and reworked some of this month's content because we were already planning on doing some other things. But with the important news about this release and it getting us one step closer to the final availability of Windows Server 2016, we thought it was really important to jump on this as soon as possible. So some of the things that we'll cover in this session will be some of the changes that we've seen in Windows Server Essentials. We'll also revisit some of the capabilities that Windows Server Essentials has had for those of you who aren't familiar with it. From there, though, we'll be focusing on some of the new capabilities that have been added or enhancements to Hyper-V, storage, networking, remote desktop services. Then I'll talk about two of the big events that are coming up, as well as the additional resources you should be looking at, because obviously you will want to get a hold of these technical previews so that you can start evaluating them. So let's take a look at just a quick summary of Tech Preview 5. So just to put things in perspective, this is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of how much there is to cover on Windows Server 2016. So those of you who've already been paying some attention to it are probably already fully aware of that. But for those of you who are thinking it's just a minor incremental update, well, I guess if you look at it in terms of how you choose to work with it, there will be a lot of ways that you can treat it that way. But for those of you that really want to dig deeper and really start leveraging some of the capabilities, there's a lot more that we're not even really touching on in this session. So things such as Hyper-V containers, other things like Windows Server containers, some of the other networking capabilities that have been added in, are things that we might briefly mention in this recording, but in the next few months you'll find that there's a lot more that we start covering. So let's start off with Windows Server Essentials, and in this we'll cover off some of the things that it has done previously, but also introducing some of the things that you need to think about moving forward. So first up with the Active Directory integration, so you can see here I've included some screenshots of Tech Preview 5. So those of you who are already familiar with the integration components that are included with the Essentials product will see that it looks pretty similar, except now underneath the Microsoft Cloud Services integration, we've got a few more options there, and we'll talk about some of those. But with Active Directory integration, this is still providing very similar functionality to what we had before. So it easily allows us to assign identities to on-prem users that already exist, or we can go through and as we're creating new users, have the cloud identities created automatically in Microsoft Online Services for those users. So that way when you're ready to leverage them for other services, they're ready to go. Now, for more and more people though, questions that start coming up around using this Active Directory integration is, where should you use this versus where should you use Azure Active Directory Connect? Now, for those of you with just simple password hash type requirements where you want the username and a hash of the password synchronized into Azure Active Directory so that Office 365, etc. can leverage it, something like this is going to be able to provide the capabilities that you need. However, if you are starting to look at some of the more advanced capabilities that products like Azure Active Directory Premium provide, then they do actually require the Azure Active Directory Connect product. Now, what's important to note here is that with Windows Server Essentials, it's currently not compatible with Azure Active Directory Connect. So you need to bear that in mind if you are thinking about maybe starting with one and moving towards the other. If that's the way that you're thinking, you probably need to start off thinking about Windows Server 2016 and enabling the Essentials role, for example, rather than doing it with Windows Server 2016 Essentials. And the same applies to 2012 R2 Essentials and Standard as well. Now, as we take a look at the Office 365 integration, there's really not that much more to cover here versus what we've spoken about in the past, where it allows us to very easily assign licenses to users as we're adding them to our on-prem environment. We've got some basic SharePoint Online settings that we can change around document libraries, for example. We can see some basics around Exchange mailbox sizes. There's some mobile device management capabilities exposed. But overall, though, don't expect to see too much that's changed here versus what you see through the previous versions. Now, one of the important things with this is that one of the reasons why they don't really expose too much from within here is that because there's so much that you can do within the Office 365 Admin Center, trying to replicate that functionality inside of this standalone portal or standalone Essentials dashboard, it doesn't really make sense to try to, expose things, especially knowing that things are going to be changing or always change on the back end with Office 365 in terms of different capabilities. So they just give you some basic functionality, but generally recommend that you do use the admin center when you do need to go through and do, larger scale customizations. So next up, something else that hasn't really changed too much is Microsoft Intune also being easily licensable through this. So there's no additional Intune functionality currently exposed through this user interface. So it's like what we saw with Windows Server 2012 R2 Essentials. It shows us that we can have that integration, but it's really just from the username and password sync capabilities. So let's move on to one where things have changed. And in this case, it's the Azure Virtual Network. Now, this allows us to go through and extend our on-prem workloads into an Azure Virtual Network. Now, what this means is that we can have things like virtual machines, such as domain controllers, etc. Maybe other line of business applications, for example, either running in Azure or in Azure Virtual Networks on virtual machines or running on-prem, and have them communicating with each other. And how it does this, it establishes a site-to-site IPsec VPN. It can leverage just the inbuilt Windows Server routing capabilities, or alternatively, it can leverage your device. So if you've got a device that supports, I won't go through the full specs, but if it supports things like, AES encryption, 128 or 256-bit IPsec, just to get started, and there's a good chance that you should be able to get that talking into Azure without too many issues whatsoever. Now, something else that's already been that was included previously, but still in here, is the Azure Backup. So we can start doing backup of our on-prem workloads into the Azure Backup service. Now, the point that I've called out here is that the cost is based on the amount of compressed storage used. So you've got the ability to go through and, even though you might be backing up, several hundred gig of data, if that data is compressed down to 1/10 of its size or 1/5 of its size, you're only paying for the amount of disk space that it's actually taking. So you're not paying exorbitant amounts based on how much data you're using. It's based on how much is actually being stored. Now, you've also got very flexible policies here in terms of how many checkpoints do you want. You can have up to 99 years worth of copies set aside, for example. So you've got a lot of flexibility here in terms of the frequency and how long you actually want to keep those backups. Now, obviously, as we go through and get closer to release, we will be, we'll put together a session where we'll focus purely on all of these capabilities inside of Windows Server Essentials and record some of the video so you can see all of these integration pieces in action. Now, the other piece that's been added in, so another new feature that's in here, is Azure Recovery. Now, Azure Recovery services allow you to provide effectively a replica of your on-prem virtual machines and network and storage, so that if you do need to fail over to a remote location, you can just leverage Azure infrastructure for that rather than having to have two data centers or two sets of servers, for example, or in two different locations. So this is something where you need to go through and you've got the ability to set it up so that you've got the real failover network. You can have test failover networks. So they just make it really easy for you to go through and start building out these plans so that if there is a disaster on-prem, that you can start bringing things back up online in Azure Recovery Services, and it will also do it intelligently. So if there are custom scripts you need to run, if there are certain things where it's like, well, if it's starting here, we need to make sure that the domain controller is starting before the SQL Server, for example. These are all the types of things that we can do in Azure Recovery with the different types of orchestration capabilities that it's got. So let's move on now and start talking about some of the more general features in Windows Server 2016 and some of the capabilities that they provide. And let's kick off with some of the storage enhancements. So with storage, probably some of the big changes that you'll see here is around the way that it works with storage spaces. So now we've got storage spaces direct, and what this allows is for you to have internal storage called, instead of it sort of going out to JBOD, for example, in this case, it's going through, it can leverage local SATA drives, whether we're talking about mechanical drives or SSDs, as well as leveraging some of the really, really high-performing NVMe drives. So all of a sudden, it means that we can start having all of this storage self-contained within the server itself. So this starts giving us a lot more flexibility, and in some cases can really start driving the costs down. Now, other features that have been added into the storage capabilities, a new one here is storage replica, and this gives us block level synchronous replication between servers or clusters for disaster recovery. And it also allows us to start doing things like stretching a failover cluster between sites. Now, there are different ways we can set this up. We can do it through synchronous or asynchronous replication. So with synchronous replication, we can have mirroring of the data in the physical sites. We've got crash consistent volumes to ensure zero data loss at the file system level. But if we don't have the network performance required to allow this, then we can start looking at asynchronous replication. And what this does is it allows us to extend out further, but knowing that there is going to be latency. Now, this is something that is really, not a problem with the storage replica itself. It's just more a matter of, you can't, have, gigabit or 10 gig speeds between different cities, for example, at an affordable price at this point in time. But from one location to another within the same city, you can definitely be presented with a few different options around high performance, but not prohibitively expensive data options. Now, another area that's been drastically improved is the data deduplication of Windows Server. And some of the big things now is that Microsoft has got official support for volume sizes up to 64 terabytes and support for file sizes up to 1 terabyte. Now, the way that they've been able to go through and make a lot of these enhancements is going through and increasing things like the way that it does the calculations of deduplication. So now you've got a multi-threaded deduplication pipeline, so more CPU cores will be used to go through and compress the data, which means that you'll end up getting much larger volumes that will be, basically you won't have to worry about data churn, not being or outpacing the rate at which the data deduplication can occur. And one of the ways that Microsoft addressed this in Windows Server 2012 R2 was, they suggested to customers to keep their volume sizes a lot smaller than 64 terabytes. That way you could have, you could kick off multiple dedupe jobs at the same time, and it would basically have a thread for each of those jobs. Whereas now you can have it multi-threaded within the same volume. Now, another thing that's important here is you've got support in nanoserver deployments. Now, nanoserver is something that we'll talk about in some of the upcoming video recordings, but it's the lightweight way of being able to deploy Windows Server and start adding roles and capabilities very simply with much lower footprint. So this is something that we'll talk about in the future, but for now it's important to understand that the data deduplication capabilities are something that nanoserver does support. Another enhancement that we've got is now that you've got storage quality of service can be centrally managed and monitored. So what this means is that you can set it at the top level and have it then pushed down to multiple servers within the organization if there are multiple servers. Now, in a smaller environment, this may not be that critical, but for those of you who perhaps provide some hosting services to your customers, this is obviously something that is probably quite important for you. So it's definitely going to make things a lot easier rather than you doing it at a machine level. Now, a very important one where there have been quite a few changes, and we'll talk just about some of them today, are some of the enhancements that we've seen to Hyper-V. So one of the big changes now is you've got production checkpoints that instead of relying on the VM safe state, which they did previously, now it goes through and it relies on the technology within the VM itself. So for Windows VMs, it uses volume shadow copies, and for Linux VMs, it makes sure it goes through and it flushes the file system buffers. So that way you've got consistency that the OS is aware of, and this means that you start getting much better performance over time rather than it being something that Microsoft generally didn't recommend running checkpoints in production with earlier versions of Hyper-V. Now, if you do want to keep using the old version of checkpoints in your dev and test labs, for example, this is definitely something that you can configure. But for production environments where you think you may need to use production checkpoints, definitely embrace the new approach that Microsoft's taking here. Another important change that you've got now is the inclusion of Hyper-V containers. So we'll cover containers in an upcoming recording, but for now the important piece around containers is that it allows you to run lighter weight virtual machines that basically give you the ability to run isolated workloads. So instead of building out entire VMs to run a particular workload and thinking, well, what's the performance impact going to be of having, Windows Server running on top of Windows Server, for example, well, all of a sudden now you can start, reducing that overhead. So the CPU overhead, the disk overhead, the memory overhead. So you end up getting a much more scalable solution, and this is something that Hyper-V containers will definitely provide for you. Now, you've also got improved management of virtual machines at the host OS level. So Windows PowerShell Direct gives you the ability to go through and communicate with the virtual machines via Hyper-V rather than having to open up the network ports on those virtual machines to allow you to start performing the remote management capabilities. So definitely a nice one from a security perspective. So another big change that we've got here is there's now support for something called Storage Spaces Direct. And what this does is it gives us the ability to have what's called a hyper-converged Hyper-V solution. So this means that if we've got a requirement to have multiple Hyper-V servers in the past, and if we wanted to do high performance live migrations, for example, then this is the kind of thing where we would have needed to have dedicated shared storage. But now with Storage Spaces Direct, with a minimum of 3 servers, we can go through and have those 3 Hyper-V servers all with local storage using Storage Spaces Direct, but have Hyper-V running on top of that and running in a supported way by Microsoft. So this means that we've got 3 servers set up and it's wizard driven, so it really makes it simple for you to go through this whole process and configure everything. But it means that you can start having, in the past where if you needed to cluster 2 servers, the 3rd server would have been, just shared storage. In this case, you could have all 3 servers running Hyper-V with these Storage Spaces Direct and start getting the benefits of having all of that processing in storage, not just having one server that's sitting there, really just doing storage and not much more. Other enhancements that have come through, the ability to go through and hot add and remove network adapters and memory. So this is an important one because a lot of the time, you may not be wanting to restart the VMs, and if it's just to add memory or change some of the network configuration, maybe to add a secondary network adapter, it's really something that wasn't a great experience where it's like you had to plan for downtime for those types of scenarios. So now this is something that is supported. So for network adapters and memory, you can go through and you've got much more flexibility in terms of what you can configure while the virtual machine is running. And now the final one, which has got 2 different types of scenarios that it will apply to, nested virtualization. So from a dev and test perspective, it means you can have Hyper-V running on top of Hyper-V. So you could have an entire Hyper-V environment in terms of virtual switches, etc., all set up, still have external connectivity, but then pick up that entire environment and move it over to another Hyper-V environment and have it continue to run. Now, in a dev and test environment, if you think about it from running Windows 10 and then having another Windows 10 VM or Windows Server with Hyper-V running underneath that, so that you've got abstraction, and it means that you can very easily move that. But this also applies to certain types of data center approaches you may think about as well, where you just want the ability to really abstract yourself from the underlying hardware, and that's what nested virtualization allows you to perform. So now moving on to some of the networking enhancements. So for these, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more that we'll talk about in some of the upcoming sessions. But the first one is that now you've got a network controller which gives you a centralized and programmatic way of managing, monitoring, maintaining physical and virtual adapters across the network. So instead of doing things at an adapter by adapter level, now you can set centralized policies and then have them pushed out to multiple adapters. So obviously that idea of being able to scale and manage things more centrally is definitely becoming much more widespread. And now you've also got some similar capabilities here with Hyper-V virtual switching, which basically allows you to start doing more centralized approaches to creating distributed switches and routing across different Hyper-V hosts. So it really starts giving you a lot more flexibility, and in this case with the Hyper-V virtual switch, it's really targeting more of a a larger scale deployment, not necessarily a typical SMB deployment, unless you're looking at this from a hosting provider perspective. So now moving on to remote desktop services. So obviously this hasn't gone ignored. So let's talk about some of the important things here as the last set of feature updates that we'll cover for today. So some of the big ones here, if you think about those customers you've got that weren't able to use remote desktop server scenarios because even though remote FX support was there, it didn't necessarily work the way that they wanted it to work. So they may have had apps that needed OpenGL support or OpenCL support, but remote FX only previously supported DirectX. So this has now been updated. So we'll talk a bit more about this in a future update. But the other important piece here is that we've got something called direct device assignment. So this means that the GPU can be assigned directly to the virtual machine. And that means that the virtual machine uses the video driver that the hardware vendor provides. So if it's looking for a driver that supports OpenGL, that supports OpenCL, it's actually using the native driver of the hardware vendor rather than a virtual driver that the Hyper-V is presenting to it. So this means that if you've got an application that says, well, that normally would fail a check going, well, I can't run because I can't access the hardware. In this case, it does have that driver access available. Now, other enhancements that you'll see in here are things around enhanced video streaming support, so enhanced codec support capabilities, as well as the ability now to have dedicated 1 gig of video memory as well as 1 gig of local memory. So, a combined total of 2 gig of virtual memory, video memory support per guest. So really this is a big change versus what we had in the past. So that's really it for the first look at some of the new features that have rolled out. Some of these have been enhanced in Tech Preview 5. Some of them were things that were in the earlier tech previews. But now that we're in the home stretch, it's important to get an understanding of what some of these top level capabilities are. So let's move on now and talk about some of the upcoming events that Microsoft has got planned. Now, none of these are in the immediate future, so because we're sort of getting closer towards the end of the year, you'll probably start to see a bit more of a bump over the coming months as everyone tries to get things finished before the end of June. But for now, the published events that are out there, the first one, for those of you looking at, trying to figure out how do you work more closely with Microsoft, if your business is changing and you're not quite sure what to do, and you want to look at, how these different Microsoft products work with the partner ecosystem, then the Australian Partner Conference is really the one you should take a look at. It's in September. It's at the Gold Coast Convention Centre. So just go to partner.microsoft.com.au/APC 2016. Or alternatively, you've got Microsoft Ignite Australia. Now, Ignite, the last Ignite was in November 2015, but because the US Ignite event has been pushed out until late 2016, it means that there's really not time between then and the end of the year for the Australian Ignite event to run. So instead, this is now moved to be something that's running on the 14th to the 17th of February on the Gold Coast. Now, this is more important for those of you who are very focused on the technical side. So, if you're the business owner and sort of concerned about long-term plans, then Australian Partner Conference is the one. But if you really want to, go to sessions where you can learn a lot more about the technology, meet up with a lot of the subject matter experts who come out from the US, for example, there are lots of hands-on labs. You can sit Microsoft exams. There's a ton of different activities that you can do there. Well, that's, as I said, it's now moved to 2017. Again, it's at the Gold Coast Convention Centre. So I definitely recommend that you go to either one of those, but obviously we understand that it's something that not everyone can send someone out of the business for 3 to 4 days at a time. But for those of you who can, they're definitely worth attending and experiencing. Now, to wrap up for the resources, we've got the usual ones. We've got Smart HQ, which is where you'll get a lot of information from Microsoft Australia around what different programs, promos, sales and marketing activities that are taking place in the market. But we've also got the Australian OEM team blog site, which I look after, where you'll find a lot more information on Windows 10, Windows Server, how they integrate with different cloud services, just to give you an idea of the types of things you should be thinking about with the customers that may be refreshing older servers and thinking about, well, how do we replace what we've done previously? And this is that's where we deliver a lot of that information. Now we've also got the pre-sales email address for the OEM server product. So OEM server AU. So if you've got pre-sales information, so does a product do this, as opposed to, or alternatively, if it's a licensing question, if you're not sure of what virtualization rights are included, questions around applying software assurance to OEM product, etc. They're the types of things that we're more than happy to address over on that alias. And it's really the easiest way to get a hold of the entire OEM server team in Australia. And then finally, one that I've included this month, because we've spent so much time talking about Windows Server 2016 Tech Preview 5, you can go to the eval center. So I've got the URL listed there. I won't read the full thing out, but if you just go to your browser and search TechNet Evaluation Center, it will bring the URL up for you. But in there, you've got a variety of different technical previews available for Windows Server. You've got the Essentials technical preview. You've got Windows Server itself, which will also have the Nano Server capabilities, and you've also got the Hyper-V Server 2016 Technical Preview 5 as well in there. So I strongly recommend that if you've got the option of depending on bandwidth, downloading them all, testing them out, firing them up in virtual machines to see how they go, definitely do that. But obviously they're all 3 gig or so in size. So if you've got a slower connection or a capped connection, probably something where you may want to tread a little bit carefully there. So that's it for this month's update. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining us for the May update. So we're on the home stretch for this financial year in Australia. So stay tuned for any different types of promotions, etc., that are running towards the end of financial year. Keep an eye on smarthq.com.au, and for more information about Windows Server 2016 especially, keep an eye on the Australian OEM team blog site. And what we try to do here is keep it more focused on the OEM and the SMB side, rather than just sort of focusing heavily on enterprise pieces, because a lot of the other blogs for the different teams do cover the enterprise stuff in a lot more detail. So with that, what I'd like to do is thank you again, and look forward to you joining us next month, and look forward to seeing you out on the road when we kick off our next series of events.